Every major war produces one piece of technology that rewrites the rules. World War I had the machine gun, which turned open-field infantry charges into mass suicide. World War II had the aircraft carrier, which made the battleship, the single most prestigious weapon on Earth just a few years earlier, no longer the most decisive factor at sea. The Cold War had the nuclear weapon, which made total war between great powers something to be avoided rather than won. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is producing its own version of that, but this time it's not a single weapon at all. Instead, we're looking at an entire category of weapons, mass-produced by the thousands, that turned a war Ukraine was supposed to lose in a few days into one it's now been fighting for more than 4 years. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and practically started preparing for the victory parade the moment its first soldiers crossed the border. Many Western intelligence assessments suggested Kyiv could fall within days or at most a few weeks. At the time, Ukraine wasn't being handed NATO's newest weapons or the systems designed to win a high-intensity war. Instead, it largely received older equipment that allies could spare, much of it already scheduled for retirement. Ukraine received 80-year-old armored vehicles, retired artillery pieces, and fighter planes that were being openly replaced with newer models. Whatever sat in a NATO warehouse gathering dust, Ukraine was liable to receive as part of generous donations. But any support was fine because Ukraine didn't have anything of its own. That was the starting point. 4 years later, that same country is training NATO militaries, supplying allied governments with battlefield technology, and hosting Western defense executives who want to learn how Ukraine builds weapons faster and cheaper than they can. And there is one shift, more than any other, that explains how that happened. Ukraine turned itself into the world's foremost laboratory for drone warfare, and it did it faster than anyone, including its own government, expected. We have to start with why Ukraine had no other choice but to become a weapons developer. Russia's invasion force outnumbered Ukraine's in almost every traditional category: artillery, tanks, aircraft, cruise missiles, and raw manpower. Ukraine couldn't outproduce Russia in conventional systems, and even the weapons it received from the West arrived slowly, in limited numbers, and often with political strings attached. For example, most of the long-range weapons that Ukraine received in the first 2 years couldn't be used outside of Ukraine's territory, making them only useful for limited strikes in occupied lands. What Ukraine did have was a deep pool of software engineers, a startup culture that had grown out of its IT outsourcing industry, and a battlefield that was providing brutal, constant feedback on what worked and what got soldiers killed. So necessity turned into doctrine. Drones became the answer. They were cheap, they were fast to iterate, and they didn't require an industrial base on the scale of Russia's. The first wave of that shift is one most people who followed the war already know: small commercial quadcopters, repurposed for reconnaissance and then for attack. Ukraine's government developed what it called the Army of Drones, a state-backed program to buy, train, and distribute first-person view drones to units at scale. Volunteers and soldiers strapped explosives to consumer airframes that had been designed to film weddings and real estate listings, and turned them into precision weapons that could destroy a tank for a few $100s. They were crude, but effective. By the third year of the war, FPV strikes were responsible for a majority of destroyed Russian armor. According to one widely cited Ukrainian estimate, drones were responsible for over 80% of Russian battlefield casualties. Independent verification of that exact figure is difficult, but few dispute that drones have become the dominant battlefield weapon. The production model behind that shift matters almost as much as the drones themselves. Ukraine built the system similarly to how startups build products. It used hundreds of small manufacturers, some operating out of garages and repurposed workshops. But apart from the number of producers, the scale and tempo were important too. Ukraine was iterating on airframes and payloads in cycles measured in weeks rather than years. This was directly helped by soldiers at the front, giving feedback on what worked and what failed within days of a new batch reaching the line. That decentralization also turned out to be a defensive strength. Russia can and does strike Ukrainian defense facilities, but there is no single factory that could be destroyed and significantly dent Ukraine's drone output. Drone warfare is also how the front line itself started functioning less like a traditional trench war and more like a saturated kill zone. Kilometers of the front are watched constantly by reconnaissance drones and covered by FPV teams able to strike almost anything that moves within it. Advancing through that zone has become extraordinarily costly for either side, which is a large part of why the front has shifted so little in some areas, despite enormous casualties on both sides. What's easy to miss is how quickly the sophistication escalated once that first wave proved itself. Ukraine didn't stop at explosive-laden quadcopters. It began developing dedicated strike drone families like the FP series of one-way attack systems, purpose-built for longer range and heavier payloads than anything available off the shelf. These were domestically engineered munitions, designed from the start to be mass-produced and designed to hit targets Ukraine couldn't reach with its existing missile inventory, fuel depots, ammunition stores, and air bases deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine also fielded systems like the Buravy, a multiple-launch rocket system, and drone hybrids that blurred the line between an artillery round and an unmanned aircraft, because the distinction stopped mattering. What mattered was range, cost per unit, and how many you could put in the air on a given night. At sea, Ukraine also faced a problem that looked on paper unsolvable. It had almost no navy left after the early months of the war, while Russia's Black Sea Fleet still had cruisers, submarines, and the ability to blockade Ukrainian grain exports. Ukraine's answer was the Magura family of uncrewed surface vessels, fast, low-profile drone boats packed with explosives, guided remotely, and cheap enough to lose in large numbers without it mattering. And those drone boats did something that would have sounded absurd in 2022. They forced a fleet with actual warships to retreat for most of the western Black Sea. Russian vessels that once patrolled freely off Ukraine's coast started operating from ports further east, out of drone boat range. Because losing a corvette or a landing ship to an unmanned boat that cost a fraction of the target's price was not a trade Russia's navy could sustain. Think of it. A country with effectively no navy had denied a regional sea power the ability to operate in its own coastline. That's not a minor tactical win, that's a rewrite of what naval power even requires. Ukraine also kept iterating on the concept. Later variants of these drone boats were adapted to carry air defense missiles, turning a surface vessel with no crew aboard into a platform that could shoot down helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft that came looking for it, closing off one of the few remaining ways Russia had of hunting the boats down. That single development mattered enormously, because it meant Russian naval aviation could no longer treat unmanned boats as an easy, risk-free target. The uncrewed vessel had gone from nuisance to a genuine anti-access threat in its own right, forcing Russian commanders to think twice before sending manned aircraft out over the Black Sea at all. The same logic reached into the air over Russia itself. Ukraine's long-range strike drones started hitting targets previously considered untouchable by Russian military command. Ukraine struck oil refineries, radar installations, and air bases, hundreds and eventually well over 1,000 kilometers from the front line. Refinery strikes alone measurably dented Russia's fuel exports and its ability to supply its own military, a form of pressure Ukraine could apply without a single manned aircraft crossing into Russian airspace. At various points in 2025-26, drone strikes temporarily disrupted around 40% of Russia's refining capacity, although much of that capacity was later restored. And then there's Operation Spiderweb, one of the boldest single strikes of the entire war. Ukrainian intelligence smuggled attack drones deep into Russian territory, concealed inside modified trucks, and launched them simultaneously against multiple strategic bomber bases thousands of kilometers apart. The operation destroyed or damaged a meaningful portion of Russia's long-range aviation fleet, aircraft that would have taken years and enormous cost to replace, using weapons that individually cost almost nothing compared to the bombers they hit. It was proof that drone warfare wasn't just a frontline tactic anymore. It was a strategic weapon capable of reaching into an adversary's rear areas and imposing costs no conventional Ukrainian capability ever could have. By 2025, Ukraine had extended the same approach to the ground. It showcased unmanned ground vehicles, essentially armed or logistics-carrying robots. They were used to resupply frontline positions, evacuate wounded soldiers, and in some cases, engage in direct combat, all without putting a person in the vehicle. And in the current phase of the war, the frontier has shifted again toward more autonomous and AI-assisted targeting and navigation. This reduces Ukraine's dependence on radio links that Russian electronic warfare has gotten increasingly good at jamming. Fiber-optic guided drones, which are immune to jamming because they have a physical link back to the operator, quickly became one of the war's most effective adaptations. The drones became so ubiquitous that the front line was soon covered in loose fiber optics from downed craft, reports suggesting local market prices for optical cables surged under the sudden demand. Eventually, the other side began to play catch-up. Russia adapted, throwing its own mass-produced attack drones, many of them Iranian-designed Shahed variants built under license, against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure in nightly barrages. Ukraine was facing the economics of shooting down a drone that cost a few $1,000s with an interceptor missile that cost a few $100,000. In addition, the interceptors were mainly donated from the West and came in limited quantities. So Ukraine developed cheap interceptor drones of its own, designed to chase down and destroy incoming Shaheds for a fraction of the cost of traditional air defense. Ukraine also fielded systems like Sunray, a laser weapon intended to counter drones and low-flying targets without expending a single round of ammunition, addressing the same cost problem from another angle entirely. This is the piece of Ukraine's drone story that's attracted the most outside attention recently, because it turns out almost every Western military is now worried about exactly the problem Ukraine has been solving for 3 years. How do you stop cheap, mass-produced drones without bankrupting your air defense budget in the process? But before we get there, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show to get all the news from the front and global geopolitics. Now, in under 4 years, Ukraine had built a domestic strike drone program from almost nothing, forced a regional naval power out of its own coastal waters with unmanned boats, developed long-range strike systems capable of hitting strategic targets deep inside enemy territory, engineered a cost-effective counter-drone defense that the rest of the world is now studying, and scaled ground robotics into routine battlefield use. Each of those developments on its own would be a notable wartime achievement. Together, they explain something bigger than any single weapons program: how a country with a fraction of its opponent's manpower and industrial base has kept fighting for years longer than almost anyone predicted. Drones didn't just supplement Ukraine's war effort, they became the substitute for everything Ukraine didn't have enough of, including soldiers. Which brings us to what's happening now. For most of the war, the flow of military knowledge ran in one direction. NATO countries trained Ukrainian recruits, often in programs run in the United Kingdom, Poland, and elsewhere, teaching conventional infantry and combined arms tactics to soldiers who in many cases had been civilians a few months earlier. But increasingly, it stopped being a one-way street. Ukrainian troops going through Western training programs have reportedly pushed back on tactics that worked on a NATO training ground but would get someone killed against Russian drone reconnaissance and artillery response times. In doing so, they've been feeding real frontline lessons back into how effective those programs are. When Poland opened a new training facility for Ukrainian soldiers, its own defense minister said the flow of lessons would go both ways, with Poland drawing on Ukrainian battlefield experience as much as it was providing training. That's a remarkable admission from a NATO member state, that the country whose soldiers are showing up to be trained has become, in important respects, the more experienced side of the exchange. The alliance also created the Ukraine Joint Analysis Training and Education Center, or JATEC, specifically to take these real-life battlefield lessons and build them into how the alliance as a whole prepares for future conflict. Ukraine's drones are now being used for testing, whether NATO units can hold up against the kind of drone saturation Ukrainian forces face every day on the front line. Ukraine is also sending its own instructors into German army schools to teach what its soldiers have learned. Denmark has brought in Ukrainian drone specialists to help build its own counter-drone capability. Poland has announced a new drone fleet explicitly built around Ukrainian expertise. This is not a handful of isolated exchange programs, it's a pattern across multiple NATO members, all pointing at the same conclusion. The alliance believes Ukraine has learned things about modern war that none of its members have had the chance to learn themselves, because none of them have been fighting a peer-capable adversary at this intensity for years on end. It's also worth noting how unusual the entire situation is. Ukraine is not a NATO member. It spent the entire war asking the alliance for weapons, ammunition, and air defense systems it couldn't produce fast enough on its own. And yet the chair of NATO's own military committee is describing that same country as a net exporter of security capability. That was more than diplomatic praise. It reflected a broader assessment shared by several NATO governments. Ukraine's drone operators, engineers, and frontline units have accumulated operational knowledge that no amount of peacetime exercises could have produced. The interest in Ukrainian technology has followed the same trajectory as the interest in Ukrainian tactics, and accelerated for a specific reason. When the conflict between Israel and Iran escalated, and the United States found itself directly involved in intercepting Iranian drone and missile attacks, American and Allied forces ran headfirst into the exact problem Ukraine had already spent years solving. How do you defend against large numbers of cheap, expendable drones without draining your air defense inventory of expensive interceptors built for a different kind of threat? That moment reportedly drove a surge of foreign interest in Ukraine's low-cost interceptor drones and in the operational expertise its air defense teams had built up countering nightly Shahed barrages. Ukrainian officials have said their technology and advisors are now being used in that region, providing exactly the kind of counter-drone expertise that a few years ago didn't exist anywhere at Ukraine's scale. Ukraine has reportedly held talks with the United States or what's been described as a large-scale drone arrangement, in which Ukraine would share its combat-tested drone technology and manufacturing know-how while purchasing other categories of weapons from American suppliers in return. The deal is basically recognizing that Ukraine's small drone expertise has outpaced what the US defense industry has fielded at comparable cost. That's a notable reversal of the usual pattern in defense procurement, where a smaller, wartime economy is usually the one begging larger allies for access to their systems. Here, it's larger, wealthier NATO members lining up for access to what a country still under active bombardment has managed to build. In most cases, these deals involve setting up production of Ukrainian-designed drones on the soil of the partner country rather than shipping finished Ukrainian hardware abroad. That distinction matters for a few reasons. First, it lets Ukraine's defense industry keep more of its manufacturing capacity focused on supplying its own frontline, where demand still vastly outstrips what any single factory can produce. Secondly, it reduces the risk that a production run gets wiped out by a Russian missile strike, since the facility making the drones is no longer inside Ukraine at all. And finally, it gives the partner nation something more valuable than a finished product: the engineering documentation, the quality control processes, and in many cases, direct working relationships with the Ukrainian teams who built the system in the first place. Ukraine's exports of finished weapons are limited precisely because its own war effort takes priority over sales abroad. But this production transfer model lets Kyiv extend its technological influence without diverting drones that its own soldiers need at the front. It would be a mistake to read any of this as Ukraine having become fully self-sufficient. Ukraine still depends heavily on Western-supplied air defense systems for the highest-end threats, particularly ballistic missile defense, where it has no domestic replacement for systems like Patriot. What has changed is the balance of the relationship. Ukraine entered this war as a country that needed everything and could offer nothing in return except gratitude. It's emerging from 4 years of grinding, brutal fighting as a country that still needs advanced Western hardware, but is increasingly able to pay for access to it, in part with expertise the rest of the alliance doesn't have. Ukrainian officials have described this as a deliberate strategic shift, away from simply asking for aid and toward building the kind of long-term technological and industrial partnerships that will outlast the war itself, whenever and however it ends. So what actually changed everything? It wasn't a single weapon system, and it wasn't a single battle. It was the decision, forced by necessity in 2022 and sharpened deliberately every year since, to treat drones not as a supplementary tool, but as the core of how Ukraine would fight a war it couldn't win by matching Russia gun for gun, tank for tank, or soldier for soldier. That decision produced a naval drone campaign that pushed a fleet out of its own waters. It produced a strike drone program capable of reaching deep into enemy territory and hitting strategic bomber bases in a single coordinated operation. It produced a counter-drone doctrine that the country most responsible for modern air power, the United States, is now studying and in some cases buying directly from Kyiv. And it produced enough accumulated battlefield knowledge that NATO built an entire institution just to make sure that knowledge doesn't disappear when the guns eventually go quiet. Ukraine didn't just survive the war by adopting drones. It rewrote what the rest of the world assumes a modern military needs to look like, and it did it while still fighting for its own survival every single day. That approach changed everything, and every military watching this war closely knows it. Meanwhile, there is Russia's situation, where things are unfolding in the opposite direction. President Vladimir Putin is becoming increasingly isolated, and even his closest allies in the Kremlin are no longer confident about his chances of staying in power. To learn more, check out this video, and make sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more news on global events.